Says Michael Popok, Legal AF. Well, we already have a ruling by the D.C. appellate three-judge panel against Donald Trump, against his lawyer, Evan Corcoran, the lead lawyer in everything related to Mar-a-Lago and the documents, national security documents that were improperly retained, and that criminal investigation by Jack Smith. You might be thinking, didn't I just hear earlier today on another hot take from Popok and Legal AF that they just fully briefed it over an 8-hour period by order of the appellate court, and it only all got briefed just by 6 a.m.? How could we possibly be talking about a ruling just 8 hours later? We're done, ladies and gentlemen. We are completely done. This is a 14-hour process by the appellate court three-judge panel, and they have ruled against Donald Trump. They have ruled to support the trial judge, the then chief judge of the D.C. Circuit Court, Beryl Howell, who at the time, until she left the position and became just a regular old trial judge, she was responsible for all of the grand juries in the District of Columbia, that including the ones Jack Smith is prosecuting in front of, related to Donald Trump. Evan Corcoran, who had all of the decision-making related to the Mar-a-Lago documents from the beginning, from the initial interaction between Donald Trump and the National Archives, the pretty please return all the documents, all the way to the subpoena that the Department of Justice had to issue because they were getting foot dragging from Donald Trump and getting nonsense and fraudulent and false statements being made to them, even by lawyers. And then the search warrant in June. All of that, Evan Corcoran touched all of that. Fingerprints are on all of that. And he's Christina Bob's boss for the purposes of interacting with the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice filed evidence with Beryl Howell on Friday to convince her, based on the evidence that they had, that they at least had a prima facie amount of evidence present to establish that Donald Trump committed a crime related to the Mar-a-Lago documents, and that he wittingly or unwittingly had his lawyers involved in that process. In other words, he used the lawyers to perpetrate the crime. The witting or unwitting part is whether the lawyers knew. It doesn't matter under the crime fraud exception of the attorney-client privilege, which we've talked a lot about. And in piercing the attorney-client privilege, it doesn't matter whether the lawyer participated willingly in that conspiracy or was duped by his own client. It just matters whether there was a fraud or a crime committed in the obtaining of the legal advice in the communications. And Beryl Howell on Friday ruled that there was. Trump and Corcoran moved for an appeal and to stay the order. And while the appellate court gave them the briefest of stays, really just from Saturday until Wednesday, that's it. They said, we're going to brief this really, really quickly. We're going to make this decision really quickly. Why? Why, you might be wondering, are they moving so quickly? I'll give you one reason. It may be because Jack Smith is on a fast track to making a charging decision, an indictment of Donald Trump related to Mar-a-Lago. Of all of the moving parts of all the grand juries in Washington, we've always thought on our podcast, Legal AF, that the one that Jack Smith was closest to, the simplest case, was Mar-a-Lago. And the fact that the appellate court moved so quickly off of the ruling on Friday by Judge Beryl Howell indicates to me that the Department of Justice has let it be known that they're at the very end. If they're not on the 1 yard line of making the charging decision, which of course is a recommendation by the special counsel to Merrick Garland. Merrick Garland can override it. I don't think he will here. And then it's the it's getting the indictment returned from the grand jury. They're moving awful quick here about top secret documents. Could be national security rationale for that. More likely, Department of Justice has got an itchy trigger finger and they want to indict. They need Evan Corcoran to go back in without attorney-client privilege and do it. So we've got a ruling today. We've got a ruling just hours after the full briefing by Donald Trump's lawyers and team and the Department of Justice, working throughout the night and early morning to accommodate this trial deadline set by the three-judge panel. And the three-judge panel took another 7 hours and reviewed everything and did the following. One, they said, we're getting rid of the stay. That administrative stay we put in place just to hold the ring while we looked at the issue, that's gone. Beryl Howell's decision, ordering Evan Corcoran to testify about what we think is 6 topics in and around the subpoena and search warrant. That finding that Beryl Howell made about the crime fraud exception applies. We support it. We are going to uphold her decision to compel Evan Corcoran to go back to the grand jury, could be as early as tomorrow, to give further testimony without the benefit or protection of the attorney-client privilege. And by the way, for good measure, the court has also ruled, because we can tell from the docket entry by the clerk on the long written electronic docket for every case that exists in federal and state court. We can tell from the clerk's entry that the other component of the order compels Evan Corcoran to turn over his attorney notes on these issues and even some phone call transcripts that apparently Evan Corcoran has for phone calls that I mean, there's nothing like not trusting your client. You record phone calls and then you create transcripts of those phone calls. I mean, it's insane, but he has them. And now he's been ordered by the appellate court in the D.C. Circuit, the 3-judge panel, to turn those over to the Department of Justice. So he's got nowhere to hide. There's no more fig leaf for Donald Trump or Evan Corcoran. They got to go into the belly of the beast and now testify before the grand jury without any insulation of the attorney-client privilege. So says the 3-judge panel. A very interesting 3-judge panel, not only 3 Democratic appointed judges, 2 of them by Biden. One of them, Michelle Childs, was on the shortest of short lists to be a U.S. Supreme Court justice in the seat now occupied by Ketanji Brown Jackson. If you recall, she was the one from South Carolina that Lindsey Graham was pushing hard for Joe Biden to pick. Well, Joe Biden picked her, but picked her for this position where she's on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, the highest court just below the Supreme Court in the hierarchy of all of the federal courts. That's where we are. 8 hours, 9 hours of briefing, 9 hours of consideration by the 3-judge panel. So what happens next? Everybody might be thinking, we can't wait for the next hot take. Popok, tell us what happens next. There's two different streams. The road divides as follows. One, Donald Trump can ask for what's called an en banc review by the entirety of every judge on the D.C. Circuit. That D.C. Circuit bench, which is about 20 or so judges, that skews Democrat. I'm not sure he's going to win with an en banc review of what these 3 judges did, knowing these 3 judges voted in unanimity and completely 3-0 against Donald Trump. I think that's not going to work for him at the en banc level. So he can skip that, take that order, and ask for an emergency review by the U.S. Supreme Court. But he's got to go through one judge in particular, who is basically the circuit judge or the duty judge over the D.C. Circuit, and that is the Chief Judge of the United States, John Roberts. John Roberts is going to have to, if he's asked, buy a quick application, which is as hard as Trump is fighting tooth and nail to avoid Evan Corcoran's phone transcripts and notes to go to the Department of Justice to stop that from happening. You can be assured he's going to try to go for a John Roberts special and get a special fast shadow docket review. Now, John Roberts has 2 choices. He can review the papers and make a decision on his own. He's empowered to do that on an emergency appellate basis. He can ask for a briefing to him. He can put another stay in place for a short amount of time, stop Evan Corcoran from testifying or turning over those notes, and ring in that bell, which can't be unrung until John Roberts has an opportunity on a fast track to look at the papers, sort of like what the 3 judges just did at the D.C. Circuit Court. He might give him another week to brief everything and hold the ring until then. Or he can decide to turn it over to the full Supreme Court and let all 9 justices decide this issue. So here's my prediction. Donald Trump skips the en banc review, doesn't ask for the full D.C. Circuit to do it. He does a fast track, Saturday night special to John Roberts. He tries to convince John Roberts alone to make the decision to first grant a stay, allow for full briefing, and make the decision himself, and not turn it over to the full panel. Here's what I think happens. Trump does that. John Roberts issues an order of another administrative stay for another short amount of time, maybe a week. asked for full briefing on a fast track between Donald Trump's lawyers and the Department of Justice, just like they just got through doing. Go take a nap, Department of Justice. I know you just finished your brief at 6 a.m. or a little bit before, because you're going to be briefing again to the Supreme Court, I think, starting maybe even as early as tomorrow or later in the week. And then John Roberts is going to decide, given how important this decision is and who the target is in Donald Trump, whether he's going to make this decision himself, rejecting or granting the decision of the 3-judge panel, or he's going to kick it back to the full panel, the full 9 of the Supreme Court. I think he kicks it back to the full 9 of the Supreme Court. And then we got to do the numbers. We got to, how high can you count? And how many people will support Donald Trump in this? Now, look, up until now, for those that are just joining, generally this Supreme Court, even though right wing and MAGA, has sided with the Department of Justice and against Donald Trump on issues related to presidential papers, testimony at the grand jury level, and even a little bit of the attorney-client relationship and privilege and communication privilege. Those have generally gone against Donald Trump, even though he handpicked many of these people on the Supreme Court. But we're going to have to see with this sort of lawyers being asked to be witnesses, compelled to be witnesses, with the attorney-client privilege being stripped away from them, with attorney notes being turned over. This is big stakes stuff now. This is high-ticket stuff. I think it goes to the full U.S. Supreme Court eventually, and I think they make a ruling ultimately, maybe 5-4, but ultimately in favor of the Department of Justice. But we'll follow it just like we're following all of these fast-moving locomotives of stories around the various jurisdictions, criminally and civilly, on Donald Trump. Not just District of Columbia, Georgia with Fani Willis, New York with Letitia James on the civil side, Alvin Bragg on the criminal side, and all the civil cases, including the civil rape case, which is now scheduled to go to trial in New York against Donald Trump on the 25th of April. We follow it all. I do a hot take like this. I used to say about every day. I'm doing them about every hour now, given how fast this wheels of justice are moving. And then to kind of bring it all together every Wednesday and Saturday, I co-anchor a podcast called Legal AF, which is the leading political and legal podcast out there. We're doing it on YouTube. We're doing it on every place you can pull your podcast. And we have co-anchors, Ben Meisalis, co-founder of MeidasTouch and a criminal defense lawyer in his own right, and a plaintiff's lawyer, and Karen Friedman-Agnifilo, formerly the number 2 prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office. And she's got some very insightful things to say about all things Trump prosecution. If you like what I'm doing, you can follow me on all social media, including Twitter, at MS Popok. This is Michael Popok, Legal AF, breathlessly reporting.
Lock him up! Indictment season is upon us. Celebrate with the new Indictment Season t-shirt and v-neck exclusively at store.meidastouch.com.